So today's session is designed to be a question and answer session around the integration with Intelligent Office and eValue. So what I'm going to do first of all is just go through a little bit of information about the eValue and our background and our systems. Once I've done that, I'm going to hand you over to my colleague Andrew Storey, and Andrew's going to go through having a little bit of a chat about what we do and how we do it and why we do it. That hopefully will answer some of the questions we've received prior to the meeting today, and then after that we can then have a look at some more individual questions. We have received some in advance, as I said, but we also have you on the line so you can get involved and hopefully partake in asking more questions. So moving on to the next slide, what I'm going to do is show you a little bit of information here about eValue. So you've got 4 boxes in front of you. So if we work through them, eValue has been established for 4 years, but we've actually been running as the group of employees who worked in Towers Watson's Towers Perrin since 1993. So the group of people in that part of the company have been long established and have been working towards showing clients how to understand risk and how to demonstrate risk to their client and understand their client's capacity for risk and loss, but also for stochastic forecasting for an awful long time. 4 years ago, eValue, the set within that part of the company, wanted to get more involved in helping the consumer and the end user via IFAs. And one of the ways in which we could actually do this was to basically move away from Towers Watson. So a management buyout took place in 4 years ago, and since then they have been working independently. We are a team of specialists who provide tools to the financial services marketplace. We look at tools for the individual. So we do have things called, which are MoneyBee, which is a direct-to-consumer option. We then have the eValue solution, which is where we work with the large institutions, and some of the things that we have you may well have already seen. Also, we have something called Advisa Centa, and it's the Advisa Centa that is the bit that we're going to be looking at with you today. We like to consider ourselves to be thought leaders. We're always trying to come up with new thoughts, new ideas, and new messages. And we work very closely with experts in various different fields. So whilst we have experts within our company that can deal with the stochastic modelling itself, when it comes to risk profiling and actually understanding clients' the way they respond and the way they deal with risk, we actually go to Cambridge University and work with a lady called Helen Barron, who is a specialist in this area. So who have we worked with in the past? As I've mentioned earlier on, while some of you may have never used eValue before or even heard of eValue, you may well have come across our tools. Recently we asked at a large conference, I think it's about 180 people there, if people could put their hands up to tell us if they'd heard of eValue. And we had a handful of people put their hands up. About 10% is normally what we'd expect to see. What we did get to see, though, over and above that, was we asked them how many of them have you seen a tool, and we actually showed them some little diamonds, which we'll show you later on. And we asked them how many people had seen those, and over 90% of people put their hands up, which meant that 90% of the population there had actually used up the tools, even though they didn't know it. And the way they would have done it is possibly through some of the partners that we've worked for or worked with. So we've got a list here. On the left-hand side are the institutions that we've worked for, where they deal with various different options that they play into the market space. We then have the employee benefit side. So we have on the right-hand side of the screen the areas that we worked with for employee benefits. And at the bottom are areas that we've worked for where we've supplied tools that are actually used for the individuals that work for those companies. So one of the interesting ones there is the FCA. We actually produced a tool so that the staff within the FCA could understand their pension scheme and their options a little bit more detail. So we have done a lot of work there. So moving on again, if we have a look at the tools that are available through the our systems, the light blue ones you've got there are quick tools for client engagement, and some of these are, those ones are available through the Intelligent Office system. And as quick tools, they are designed just to be very quick, very snappy, for you to get your client's attention and help them focus on the areas that maybe their finances are failing very, very quickly. The advanced tools are areas where we look at things and go into a lot more detail. So the Portfolio Analyzer is a tool that will allow us to go into detail within the client's existing portfolio, assess where they are with regard to the risk that they're prepared to take, and assess their portfolio, and then help a client see a better way of investing their money. Incentive exercises are where we work with corporate advisors on helping them with their corporate clients to look at whether they need to look at de-risking some of their pension propositions. So that's where we work with people who've got defined benefit pension schemes who are looking possibly to move to defined contributions. We have Lifetime Planner and Pensions Freedom Planner. Now, these are two tools that are cash flow modelling tools. The Lifetime Planner one is for pre-retirement and through to retirement, whereas the Pensions Freedom Planner is really focusing a lot more on closely at the retirement options and how to make money last you through retirement. And Fund Risk Assessor is a tool that is used by many fund managers to look at the fund options that they have and see where they are in the risk matrix overall. So those are the tools that we have available, and most of those ones are available within Intelligent Office, with the exception of the Pensions Freedom Planner, which is going to be coming very shortly, so it won't be much longer and you'll see that one. So why do we help clients with the Advisa Centa? The Advisa Centa is being designed to help assess many of the clients' risks and what they're prepared to do. But we make sure that everything we do is in conjunction with the papers that are released by the FCA. So the FCA, as you all know, regularly release a lot of information about assessing clients' risk, understanding a client, making sure that when a client takes an investment that they know the risks involved and they know the potential downsides as well as the upsides. So that's one of the things that we actually do. We try to make sure that everything we do can be communicated to a client in a number of different easy to understand ways. So we try to explain the risk and reward with information, numbers, pictures, descriptions, because we want to be able to cover all aspects. So we try to show things in a various different lights, but what we also do is include the client's objective. Now you might think, well, of course you include client's objectives, you're talking to a client, but of course clients' objectives might be different for different time horizons. So they may have a pension plan that they're trying to achieve a certain goal over a 20-year period, but they may have something that they're trying to achieve over a much shorter period, and therefore we need to make sure that everything that we do will cover across the time horizons. So everything we do is designed to make sure that you have a nice, neat, compliant process, but something that also makes things nice and quick for you, because we like to try and help you speed up what you do and therefore reduce your time on administration so you can spend more time with your clients and on areas where you'll hopefully be earning more money. So if we move on again, Andrew. So if we look at the forecasting methods, this is where I'm going to hand you over to my colleague, and Andrew will discuss this section with you. I will continue to monitor this question, so if you've got any questions as we go through, please put your hand up if you need to ask a question right there and then, or please type it in the box if you'd rather not talk to me, but you wouldn't mind typing a question in and I would just read the question out and we can continue from there. So if I hand you over to Andrew, Andrew, over to you.
Thank you very much. So one of the questions that we had today in advance was, why do you have different terms for risk? So why do we have different asset allocations depending on the term that you have? So I'd actually like to take a step back from that and just kind of have a look back at why advisors need to follow a risk suitability process in the first place, and that will, I think, then help to answer that question. As you're probably aware, there's the good old FSA, as it was then, suitability guidance in March 2011, which set out the good practice for risk suitability, which basically gave you 3 different areas. You've got the attitude to risk, the capacity for risk, and then a discussion about achieving your goals. So that was started out in 2011, and there has been a fair bit of conversation from the FCA since at various articles and conferences and news articles. So what you ended up with is a good few quotes from Rory Percival, the first of which helps to explain the why we have different terms for risk, and that we actually had this before the timescale context was coming in. Fundamentally, when you're looking at the investment strategy that you need to take for a client, if you're investing for 5 years compared to 25 years, you'll end up with hopefully with a different investment strategy. Clearly, if you have something like emerging markets in a portfolio, after 5 years, there's a good chance that the markets haven't picked up if there's been a downfall. So if you go for 25 years, then there's a good chance that overall you've actually getting up on the portfolio. So what we need to do when we're looking at the risk is actually be aware of that timescale context. It also means that if you have a diversified portfolio over the longer term, it actually reduces in risk simply because the portfolio balances itself out. So that's the first reason for having the different risk terms and the asset allocations. On that, along those lines, Rory was also saying that you need to take into account all of your portfolio within a risk suitability process, unless you have a specific mandate from the client to say, I will only look at one of your portfolio, one of your products. So when we were setting up our risk profiling process, and particularly within Portfolio Analyzer, we wanted to see that entire portfolio, not just one element of it. So instead of just looking at one fund and going, hey, that's a risk profile 4, what you find is that you could actually get 2 funds which added together, because of diversification, actually reduces your risk profile. So 2 3s could equal a 2. So it's very important to understand what it is you're trying to risk rate and make sure you take into account the whole portfolio. The other thing, which is a wonderful quote, I think, from the FCA, is that unfortunately life is not simple. If you have a tolerance for loss that is 3 and the portfolio is 3, that's not necessarily right. Now that's actually true, even though it doesn't feel like it's particularly sensible. The reason for that is that there are other factors that need to be taken into account, and clearly the timescale is a good one on that. A little while ago we came up with a cartoon that basically says if the computer says it's a 5, there you are, it's a 5, job done. Now that's not what they're looking for. They're looking for that discussion, they're looking for the timescale context, they're looking for experience, knowledge, capacity, all to be taken into account. Could be that you do end up with a 5, but you need to have that discussion to start off with. So the question, why do you have different terms within your asset allocations, is simply to make sure that the final investment solution that you're looking at does actually take into account the context for term. Now we did actually get a second question very close to that, which is how do you create your asset allocations? How do we actually, within Advisa Centa there are some risk profiles and you can click on them and it gives you an asset allocation. How do we actually come up with those? And I thought it might be useful if I showed you a little diagram which helps explain how we do that. Now what we're trying to do is effectively get the best outcome for the client. So it's a 3-step process. The first step is to understand what it is we're trying to measure. Now you may have seen the fan diagrams for the range of returns that an investor might get having invested a lump sum. What you have there is a range of returns at the end of the term, which is highlighted by the orange arrows at the end on the right there. And that's basically the measure of risk that we're looking at within our asset allocations and all of our optimization. So it's related to the investor because it's to do with what they end up with at the end of the term to buy for whatever their objective is, and it's looking forward. So it is actually, again, something that they're affected by, rather than looking historically where what has happened is not what they're going to be affected by. So the first thing we do when we create the asset allocations is to understand what those risk measurements is. The second thing we do is then set benchmarks at the top and bottom of the process. So I call it the ladder method. It hasn't caught on yet, but if I say it enough times, hopefully it will happen. What we do is we set it for the risk profile, the low risk profile, and the high risk profile at short term, and then the same again at the long term. That gives us 4 corners. That gives us the benchmark risk for low risk short term up to high risk long term. We can then interpolate between that, both in terms of the time and also the risk profiles. So you could end up with 10 risk profiles or 5 or 7, and because of the methodology, they're all consistent and smoothly changing over time. So that gives us the amount of risk that we're allowed to take at each of the profiles. Now, the upper end is set as 100% UK equity. That basically says that the risk profile 10 has got the same risk profile as somebody who invested entirely in UK equities with no diversification and was just exposed to the market like that. We do that because that is, for most of our clients, a sensible upper end. If you go higher than that, so you're looking at 100% in something a bit more racy, say emerging markets or Pacific equities, it makes it very difficult to actually create a portfolio which actually works with that amount of risk in it. And also, it doesn't stop you for a risk profile 10 going further up the risk scale. So you can go more risky if you want, obviously, but for a standard portfolio, we'd expect to see 100% UK equities. What you actually end up with is a good diversified portfolio which gives you a better return than just a pure single asset class because of the combinations, which is of course step 3, which is optimizing the assets to achieve the best chance of the return. Now that optimization process is done for those high level assets with some grouping involved and some criteria around liquidity risk, so not too much property, for example, and a couple of other criteria around making sure that there isn't too much in the way of overseas equities compared to UK equities. What you end up with is an efficient frontier between risk and return, which gives you a nice smooth set of results. You'll see those in Portfolio Analyzer. If you use Portfolio Analyzer, you can actually see that efficient frontier. But that, because of those criteria, it does actually mean you can beat that efficient frontier, because if you include extra asset classes which aren't involved in the asset optimization here, you could actually end up with a better return for the same amount of risk. But it tends to be quite marginal, and it's not generally a problem to have it just a slightly bit above. So I think that's probably covered the first 2 questions. What we also were being asked was about what is the benefit of producing a stochastic result, and what's the difference between us and other companies that do stochastic results. What we're looking at for the forecasts is a forward-looking methodology. So you may be used to using historic volatility in your day-to-day work, where you measure variation from a historic average. So you have a graph of returns, and you look at the average, and then you see how far away each of those points is from the average. That's the historic version, and that's quite good for measuring fund performance and to benchmark the fund against. What we are doing with our forecasting Advisa Centa is using a forward-looking view. So by taking a pile of scenarios, there's normally 1,000 used in the forecast on the tools, although we do 10,000 for actually managing the scenarios. We have 1,000 scenarios which then produce you a range of returns. Those scenarios are based on the potential outcomes, which are based on the term and the existing assets that you have. So if you're looking at, for example, cash, you think, hey, that's a nice low-risk asset class. Actually, if you hold it for the longer term, it becomes more risky, because although you end up not having any capital loss, the range of returns that you could get from that can actually increase considerably. If you think of in the good old days when cash used to have around 10, 12, maybe even 15% returns compared to where they are now at 0.5, you can see that actually the returns you get can vary widely, but it tends to move slowly over time. So within the first few years, it's likely to stay fairly stable. That's taken into account in forward-looking methodology. It might be worth explaining via the use of an example and an analogy of how we produce the stochastic forecasts. There are two different methods of producing stochastic forecasts, one of which is called a mean variance covariance, which uses historic data to project forwards, and the other is an economic scenario generator, which is the one we use, which creates a little mini world and runs a pile of scenarios through it. So the example I'm going to be using today is around a journey. Two journeys here, Newbury to Cheveley, which is 5 miles, and Newbury to Oxford, which is 30 miles. So the 5 miles is equivalent to 5 years, 30 miles equivalent to 30 years. The question is, how long will it take for me to get there? What you'd expect is that the range of potential times for a shorter journey is actually a lot less than the range of returns you might get for a longer journey, such as that 30-mile one. So to start off with, what you could do is use a statutory forecast. Now, originally, there was a statutory requirement for 5, 7, and 9, which I'm sure you're all aware of, and that means that basically you're, in this analogy, your speed is determined in advance. So the speed of the journey is exactly 50 miles an hour. That's given to you by the regulatory requirements. That's changed slightly recently because now those are maximums, and you now have asset-specific returns within your assumptions, but they're still straight lines. So whatever you pick, you're going to be not taking into account any of the timing, and there's no concept of risk. So for example, on the 5, 7, 9, there's no concept of how likely a 9% a year every year was going to be, which I suspect is fairly unlikely. The alternative is to look historically and to take an average speed. So for a car, you'd be looking at, say, the last 100 odd years of car journeys, going, what is the average speed? So I suspect that the average speed hasn't changed an awful lot, given that the better the cars get, the more traffic there is. But what you find is that, for example, a historic average speed is actually around 30 miles an hour, believe it or not. That's around the M25 on a Friday afternoon. That's probably a bit optimistic, but the 30 miles an hour as an average journey time is probably spot on, and the standard deviation on that is sort of around 10 miles an hour. Now, what that means is, having got the average speed, you can then create a distribution of that average and range of results. This is the mean variance covariance methodology, which we're not using, but I just wanted to explain the difference between the two. So if all you have is an average speed and a standard deviation, the range of results, how far away from the mean it actually is. What you end up with is a distribution which is nice and even, starting at 30 miles an hour as being most likely at 50%, and then a probability giving you a range of speeds. Problem with this is, whether you're going to Cheveley or whether you're going to Oxford, you'll still use 30 miles an hour as the most likely. In reality, for the longer journeys, you'll be going on the faster roads and it will be closer to 50. So there's no concept of time for the mean variance covariance. It is just a central assumption which is assumed to keep going forever. It does give you a nice distribution, and you can produce a nice stochastic forecast from that. However, it doesn't matter how long your journey is, you'll still end up with the same answer. That's compared with the economic scenario generator. What we do for the economic scenario generator is effectively create a model of the world. So in this case, I've got a picture of some roads, and what we're going to do is put some real life elements into that little world. So things like roadworks, queues, traffic lights, anything else that might affect the journey time. And we then put 1,000 cars through this journey and find out what length of time those cars actually end up taking to get to the end of the journey. That then gives us our results for the forecast. So a little bit like the weather, they also produce stochastic forecasts effectively on the BBC website, run a whole pile of scenarios, and the one that's most likely is the one that generally picks out either the most common or the one in the middle. So what you're seeing on the forecast from Advisa Centa is actually a little world with 1,000 scenarios going forwards of what could happen, and that range of results is therefore a lot more realistic. So that's the difference between what other people do and what we do. I guess this is probably another good point to open up to any questions. So does anybody have anything they'd like to comment or question on either the stochastic results or the asset allocations? So the question there was, how is with profits modelled in Portfolio Analyzer? Which is a very good question. The difficulty with profits, of course, is that there's smoothing involved and a whole pile of characteristics on the product, such as guarantees and MVR free dates, and all those things are unique to each of the products. And there's quite a few products out there for with profits. What we tend to find is the best is actually the assertion underneath it. When you run lots of scenarios, what you find is that the smoothing actually owns actual outcomes. So other than obviously the points where the you have the minimum guarantee, not a bit of if the guarantee is kicking in, actually you'll get more from your policy than you would otherwise get. What we see is the with profits funds are best modelled through the asset allocation with an awareness for the client that that is only an approximation to the actual product, and that the results may be slightly different from that because of smoothing or other product characteristics. So they are perfectly doable within the system, and we would generally assume that you would use ideally the long-term asset allocation, but if not, the current asset allocation for that.
Okay, thank you very much. So, does anybody have any questions they want to ask?
So on the lifetime planner,
yeah,
I've got a question about that. We did a demo last week, but at 65, the expenses went down to 0, and I'm not quite sure why.
There's a choice on the lifetime cash flow of either using expenses or a goal. So let me pull up a lifetime cash flow so everybody can see the screen. And what you can do for the goals, if I go to expenses on this, just to show everybody what's happening. So that one's continuing because what we're doing there is using expenses all the way through. If I go to the retirement planner, retirement goal, what you can do is instead of using expenses, you can use a target income option. And what you can do is basically set a target amount which means that if you put in a certain amount, the expenses will stop at retirement if you've specified them to set at retirement, and then the target amount will continue after that. So
does that answer the question, Kathy? So if you put in a target amount, what will happen is the system will take that figure going forward as opposed to the expenses that you're trying to match.
So if you put in a target amount then for retirement, you can't have a retirement amount with expenses. Is that what you're saying?
It's either a goal. So if I put that in as a wealth analysis, actually that might be easier to see because it's got different colours on it. So if I pull out the investments, you can see that that's a goal of 40,000. Whereas before, if I pull out the income, just see expenses. So the expenses will stop at the retirement age. and then that's replaced with a goal.
I mean, normally what you would expect is somebody to actually try and map their plan to their expenditure. So sometimes people will say that they want to have a goal because they don't know what their expenditure is going to be. So that's why they will put a goal in at that point. If, however, they've got an idea of what their expenditure is going to be because they know what they've got now and they know what's going to stop and start and what's going to change, and they've gone into their expenses and mapped it out to say that some things are going to stop when they retire because they're not commuting so much. Once they've added all of that information in, if they've got that, it makes more sense to use the expenses as your target in retirement. But if you don't know it, then this one gives you an alternative answer.
Right. Okay. I think I have to have a play around with it a bit more on that one.
Give me a shout if you need any more help on that. Okay?
Okay, thank you.
Okay, any other questions? We don't have any hands coming up.
I think we had, there's a couple of written questions come through. I think one was about the mini world, and you're absolutely right. So when we were looking at the asset allocation earlier, which is from David, so we were looking at our mini world here. You're absolutely right. It does depend on how good that world is. And the question that you need to be asking, and what we've spent an awful lot of time and money in, the very clever people creating, is a little mini world for that economic scenario, which does reflect reality as far as we can possibly do. And we actually had to, we've been upgrading our model of the mini world since the credit crunch, because pretty much all of the models before then would assume that if you had low interest rates, they would go back to normal quite quickly because it was a bit unusual. So that's one example where, when most of the models were built in kind of the late 80s, early 90s, what was normal was 5, 6, 7% in terms of returns and inflation and everything else, which meant if you had something around 0.5%, it was pretty much unusual, and you'd expect it to go back to normal fairly quickly. And so what we've done recently is make our mini world even better, and because we are now currently at 0.5% in cash and the yields are very low, we've taken into account the fact that it could stay low for quite some time, like it did in Japan, or it could go completely the opposite direction as they unravel quantitative easing, or it could go back to normality. Who knows? But at least we actually account the difference in that. So the asset model that is used is very, very important, and we go to a lot of effort to put in objective where we are currently, to project forwards as realistically as we can. Does that answer your question there, David?
Yes, that's fine. Thank you.
We also have a question from Gerwin Wilcox. You've got that in front of you, Andrew. Basically, the question here is asking, are there any specific investment solutions that match the asset allocations provided by eValue?
Another good question. So the answer to that is yes. As well as providing financial planning tools, we also have an asset consulting group who are supporting a couple of the larger providers to create an asset risk-rated, multi-asset rather, risk-rated fund. So, for example, Zurich has one called the Zurich, I think it's still called the Zurich Threadneedle Multi-Asset Fund, which is based on our asset allocation. So that directly maps on a 1 to 5 scale to our asset allocations and the risk profile within that. So there's a little bit of what they can do is go slightly off those because they can go for short-term tactical movements, but the risk profile is spot on. And the other company that we do it for is AXA, where the multi-asset portfolio AXA funds are also based on the same risk benchmarks. So they have the same quantity of risk within them. There are a few subtle changes to the criteria within the AXA one, but the fundamental risk profiles mapping through to the investments is still there. So both AXA and Zurich have an asset multi-asset fund mapping to our risk profiles.
Okay. Does that answer your question, Owen?
Yes, it does. Yeah, obviously it'd be nice to see 2 others using it really, but yeah.
Okay. We have had some other questions in advance. We've been asked a question that I was just trying to find it here. Hang on. About are there any tips to try and make getting the right fund easier? Because when you're using the system with the portfolio analyzer, quite often you can start typing in some information about a fund, and you get so many different choices. It's rather difficult sometimes to know what you're looking for. So what we're going to do is going to get Andrew to just show you very briefly how you can, the various different methods you've got of finding the right fund. We're just putting there. Sorry, Karen, Andrew.
Yep. So when you're typing the fund, and in fact we should probably see if we can find the Zurich multi-asset one while we're in here. You can either type in the precise name, or you can type parts of the name. So all I've typed in there is Zur and Mult, and I've got the Threadneedle multi-asset funds. So there's the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 that would. It's also got a couple of others which also have the word Zur and Mult. So if I pick one of those, that's one way of finding a fund fairly easily. The other one is if you happen to know the ISIN code or the city code, you can actually type that into the box. So rather sadly, I know that the BlackRock Gold and General city code is ME49. So if you type in the city code, you actually get directly to the fund that you're looking for. So the easiest way of getting a precise fund is to go for the ME49 or the city code, which will get you a precise entry onto a fund. There is also an advanced search. So if you can't find your fund straight away, what you can do is search for a particular fund universe, type in any part of the name, or select a fund manager group. And there's also a choice for sectors and also for crown ratings. So if you wanted to find all the gold funds which have got 5 crown ratings, you can then search, and it will give you back a list of funds from that.
Okay, thank you very much, Andrew.
Okay. There we go, and there's a list of these. There's 15 pages of them. So you might have to narrow it down a little bit further. I think we have another written question there as well. In fact, there's 2, one from Moira and one from Stephen. We do, yes. So you just give me a moment. Moira, I'm just going to take you off of mute so you can talk to us if need be. You said a question here, would you not enter a goal to make sure you meet your expenses? Can you just clarify what you mean by that?
It was just the expenses. If you plotted your existing plan against your expenses and you've got a shortfall, you would need to enter an objective then to meet your shortfall, and then that would wipe your expenses out. Is there not a way you can see both? The forecast either uses expenses or the goal. So either one of those is basically a cash outgo within the plan. So if there is a shortfall based on expenses, if I turn this round and make this onto an expenses list instead, basically you can have one or the other, but you can, when it says use expenses, that doesn't stop you putting in another goal on top if you want to. So you can have expenses and a goal, but it's just not the retirement one. It's just for the main income in retirement. Are you going to be using expenses or the goal? So now I've got the expenses going across, but I've still got a goal in there to buy a boat at age 70. Is that what you're asking, or is that a slightly different answer? No, that's fine, thanks.
Right, next we're going to have Stephen Wise. Stephen's posed a question. He says, does the cash flow tool show funds used to supplement income shortfall, and how those funds either grow or deplete? So Andrew, can you help Stephen with that one?
Yeah, I think what you're saying is basically how can the fund analysis and what you've used on the funds come through in the forecast. So what I've not got on here at the moment is the pre-retirement surplus and deficit coming through. What you can do with this, so the light green at the top is the surplus income. Clearly, he can retire a little earlier from this. So let's make a nice little shortfall. I'm making retire a little earlier. Now, hasn't got a shortfall, which means the next bit won't be particularly obvious. So I'm going to see if I can get him to retire a little earlier. And you can do that two ways. You can either drag at the bottom, or you can do a retirement link, or you can click on the name and you can edit it in there as well. So I'll do that through this one for the moment. Because at the moment I've got lump sum and a retirement start age. I'll make him start at 60. Go save. There's several different ways of changing goals. It's very flexible. This one's taking lump sum to a different age as well, to be a little bit more interesting. And what you can then do on the life plan is see the impact of changing your investments. Now that overall shortfall that you have, in this case I'm basically assuming that I spend all the surplus here. If I have this unticked, I've ticked it, therefore now using this, and what you can then do is say whereabouts you'd like to invest that money. So the question, does it show how the funds can be used to supplement the income shortfall? Yes, and it's currently in current account. If I move that into his stocks and shares ISA instead, what you'll see is the impact of investing on his overall lifeline. Now in this particular case, it's not making a lot of difference, I suspect, because what the current account is being used to meet the expenses earlier. But that stocks and shares ISA is from the list of products that this guy has. So he's got shares, stocks and ISAs on current account, and that allows you to then change funds within that.
So if we go on to David, David has raised a question. He says, when you make a portfolio for a client on the system, it pulls through charges. Where do they enter the ongoing fee and any wrap account fees? So whilst Andrew's going into that section, the charges that it pulls through, we are slowly working with FE to get this fully up to date. And what that means is that all the charges, or the ongoing fund charges that pull through, are going to be showing on the system. If it's showing 0 when you pull it through, it means that that feed is not there as yet, but hopefully give it a few more weeks and we should be fully up to date. But once you've done that, obviously that's not the only charge available. There are wrap charges and there are also advisory charges. So I'm going to hand it over to Andrew now to show you how you can allocate those charges to the system.
Yeah, thanks, Lisa. There are actually different ways. I suspect the best way is via the Intelligent Office interface, because I can show you how you'd enter it on Advisa Centa, but I suspect through the Intelligent Office version, you need to find the equivalent field there in. So you can enter additional product charges, include wrapped. I'll show you where that field. When that data is passed across from Intelligent Office, the product charge and the wrapper charge, which you can add in, can be added to it. So there's a pound amount and an annual percentage. That's where you can put in additional ongoing fees. This one, as a fund charge, could include, if you wanted, the overall wrap charge too. So if you had a wrap charge of a half, a fund charge of 0.25, you could put in 0.75, and if the second fund has got a 0.5% charge, then you're fine with the one. So that's one way of doing it. The second way is to put in just the fund charge up here and the wrapper charge down here. And when you put, for the annual percentage charges there, when you put in new products, you have a similar thing. If you're going for a new money route, you can put charges in on the left-hand side. So there's charge for new investments, which has an ongoing charge, which you can include in there. When you add a fund, these are my favourite code. I've got no idea how good Blackboard Golden General actually is. You can then put the charge in there and override the FE data feed. Okay,
but on the first slide about this, but on, if you just go back one where you talk about charges, it it always seems to come up with percentages. I mean, surely if we're charging fees, it will be a financial amount, not a percentage. If it's like an initial charge, for instance, we would charge £2,000 for investing X rather than 0.92% or whatever it happens to be. So why is that? Yeah? Because if we're supposed to be working with a fee is a fee, isn't it? It's not necessarily a percentage.
You are correct in that. So what you'd need to do is convert the pound to a percentage in order to enter it. But we will take that as feedback and see whether we could put in a pound initial charge as well.
Right.
We do understand that can, or you could just reduce, if it's an initial fee, you can just reduce the investment amount by the amount that, but then that does do a comparison.
Well, in fairness, the client's likely to give you 200,000 and then you charge the fees on top or whatever. It's unlikely you do it from the product. Right.
So if you wanted to do a comparison between where they are currently and a new product which has an initial charge on it, then you need to move the initial charge into a percentage and put it in. And if it's going to be paid on top, you might want to do a comparison without those charges because you're going to charge either way. Then you just wouldn't include it in the forecast because it's not part of the comparison.
Okay. So let me just check this right. So what you'd do on this one then is you'd put in the wrap account charge. So you'd create a wrap account on here. Then underneath that you attach the funds. Each of the funds has its own charges. Yeah.
Yeah.
And then we can actually also show the amount that we are to receive as an ongoing fee as well. Well, you do it wrap first, then attach the funds to that wrap. The only slight problem with that is that when you go to actually allocating it, you can't change the name. So if you're using more than one wrap account or more than one investment, it just says new OIC or new whatever. It doesn't allow you to actually name it. And of course, the charges do vary depending upon the product provider.
Yeah, so when you go across to the, if I was to put in an investment amount here, probably a bad example because it's not going to meet risk profile by the 10 years. But it is at least at 100%, so I'm going to move on anyway. When you go through to product allocation, it then allows you to put in an ISA, but you're saying the name of that comes up as new ISA, and it doesn't allow you to change the name.
That's right.
Yeah, we can take that one back and see if we can do something about ability to change that name as well. If you do need different products with different charges, if you can take it through as an existing product, you can actually alter the name of the existing products. So a bit of a trick is if there's anything within the new wrapper selection that you can't get hold of, whether that's a name or a particular type, what you can do is actually take it through as an existing product but with no money in it, or like a pound, and then that would allow you to control the charges and the names within that. Okay. So you take it. So it's not ideal. So we'll take back the feedback about the product name for sure. Yeah.
Because that would be fine if you did one ISA, one bond, one collective, one pension, dead easy. But most of our clients aren't like
that. Life is never that simple. No problem.
Well, hopefully not. Otherwise, the wrong kind of clients, aren't they?
As many as possible. Yes. Thank you very much for that. So that's good feedback. Thank you.
Just as a sidebar, Andrew, if you go into analyse product funds and you're looking to move it around, you can put in some charges there.
Yes.
I don't know if that's...
Yeah. I will head towards that one. So what Lisa's talking about there is if you go analyse products funds, there is actually a secondary place to put in charges there. When you add a new product, it does actually allow you to put in the charges there. So that could be another place to put in a wrap charge. And then when you move to the fund allocation, additional fund charges can be added if you want to, in addition to that charge.
Okay, right. We're coming towards the end of the session. I'm just trying to see if there's any other questions we have through that you didn't cover earlier on. You covered the benefits of stochastic modelling, didn't you?
Yep.
I think we've covered everything on the ones that we've got here. Everybody else has got any other questions that they would like to raise, if they want to put the hand up or type the question to me? If you just give me, we just have one more question come through at the moment. Right, so Stephen's come up, he's given us a really good challenge here. This is completely new to Advisa Centa, and he doesn't use it at present. He currently uses DT. And Truth. He says, can we briefly summarise the benefits of using our system? So, first of all, for me, it's the two-way integration. So everything that you do, most of the systems you use with Intelligent Office, they have this fantastic integration that all goes into the system that you use. So you'll go into DT or you go into Truth, and it will feed all that information through. With ours, we've worked very closely with Intelligent Office to make sure that that integration goes two ways. So if you go in and come up with a couple of solutions, because let's face it, it's not always one solution for a client. You might go through and look at, do I just rebalance their funds? Do I replace something? Do I move the investment around? If you go through and do all of those, and you go through the session and sort of go through the final completion bit before looking at another solution, you could come up with 3 or 4 different solutions quite easily. All of that information is then fed back into the Intelligent Office system so that they are then able to have a record of it. And you can then go through and say which one you're accepting and which one you're declining. So you've got a compliant record to prove that you didn't just go for the easiest thing that was, oh, we'll just move everything because it's easier. You can actually demonstrate to the regulator very easily that you have seriously considered all your client options. So the two-way integration is very, very important. I think personally from myself and from the feedback I've had from others that the cash flow planner is much more simple to use than most of the other ones out there. So it was just an alter, and the fact that you can alter it in various different places and it'll feed through to all over the place. So you can change it in one area and it will update everything else. And then finally, I suppose it's because we use term in looking forward at our modelling. So just because a client says that they're a risk 7, a client investing for 5 years at a risk 7 is not going to be investing in the same assets as somebody investing for 30 years who's a risk 7. And our system actually does take that into account, and everything we do is forward-looking, not backward-looking. And of course, if you're backward-looking and just assuming that where we are now is what's going to happen going forward, you're going to have a bit of an issue. When just purely from the standpoint of cash at the moment, if you have a look at cash, 5 years ago, how many people would have sat here thinking, well, at some point we're going to have cash at 0.5%, and it's going to be at 0.5% for about 5 years. We wouldn't have thought that. So actually having a system that is forward-looking and actually says, well, it could stay at 0.5%, it could go down, it could go up to the norm, or it could actually race ahead and become very high all of a sudden. So actually having something that looks at all of that, I think, is really important. Have you got anything there to add, Andrew?
No, I think that's pretty good. The extra bit on that is when you're looking at post-retirement planning, having consistency between basically prices of annuities and the other assumptions that you've got in there is also very important, because if you don't take into account the consistency in the little mini world, so for example, if there's an accident on the motorway, you can pretty much guarantee that the roads around it will be blocked. It's that kind of relationship that if you don't get right in post-retirement planning, what you end up doing is recommending drawdown or annuity, not because of that's the right thing for the client, but that's simply the choice of assumptions that you've made at that particular point in time, which can be a little bit dangerous because obviously in post-retirement there's not much you can do about it, and once you've made the decision, that's you're kind of with it. What we're seeing in the research that we're doing about the assumptions, I mean, at the moment we're kind of 2% lower with everything really than the long-term norm. So if you use current market conditions going forwards, what it means is drawdown looks rubbish because you're not going to get any returns on it after charges. So everybody would leap for annuities. Whereas if you use the long-term assumptions, you'd go for a drawdown every time because compared to today's annuities, it's much better. The reality is somewhere in between the two, where it starts off at current and ends up at the long-term assumption. We are the only system out there that does that for advisors. It's taking the power that's normally used by institutions to do that kind of modelling, and it's put into something very simple on the front end for advisors to use. But that means that what you're making decisions on, and it's clearly important that decision making is right, that can possibly be, and that's kind of why I get very excited about this, as you can probably tell.
Right, we have actually overrun, I'm afraid. In that case, Andrew and I would like to thank you for your time. We are working very closely with Intelligent Office, and we are planning to run a series of sessions after the summer holidays, because for some bizarre reason, all these people seem to want to go on holiday over the summer. So we're going to be, in September, we're going to be running a series of sessions, and these will be looking at a bit more background about ourselves, what it is we do. We're going to spend a little bit more time looking at the investment risk questionnaire in depth, how we do it, why we get the results we've got, what is our pedigree all around that. We're then going to look at our asset model and how we look at the building an asset model going forward, how we cope with current market situations. Once we've done that, we're going to spend a little bit of time running through how we meet the FCA guidelines. So we have obviously quite a few guidelines from the FCA, and we're going to go through looking at how we will address all of those. And then we're going to have a slightly more in-depth which will look at the complex tool. So the portfolio analyzer, we're going to have a full demonstration of the portfolio analyzer, the lifetime cash flow, and the pensions freedom planner, which is your cash flow for somebody who is close to or at retirement. All right, so hopefully that is all you need. If there's anything else you need or any questions, please contact your account manager. They are the person who's the first port of contact, and if they need our help, they will come to us directly. But in the meantime, thank you very much for your time. I really appreciate it.